So thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak on Mourid Barghouti. Um, and in a way, it's a little bit like, that, anybody's ever listened to it, that a radio show on BBC4 called Great Lives, that somebody who's really interested in a person speaks about them, but they have an expert as well. So it's in that sense that I'm speaking about Mourid Barghouti. I'm not an expert on him, but he's somebody that I think is really worth knowing about and reading his stuff, because for me, he's just been such an inspiring writer in so many ways. Not because he idealizes the struggle in Palestine in any sense, far from it, but because he has made me understand in a way that perhaps only a person who had visited Palestine and Israel would exactly, kind of more about the ways in which the struggle presents itself to a Palestinian and to people living in Palestine. So just to begin with, like as an Irish person living here in Ireland at the present time, it's clear that our cultural history and the Palestinian struggle are very closely connected. At the demonstrations and at meetings, there are always songs and poetry, and so many people are writing poems and songs about Palestine, some of them really very beautiful, some of them very militant, some of them not so great, but many of them really good. And so we've had joint events where there's been Palestinian and Irish music and poetry performed at, and it's been very interesting. And like there is this issue of the of the culture of struggle, and actually it's a funny one, because for me, I feel that the kind of idealized culture of struggle I don't like. The one where everybody's heroes and, nobody's afraid, and where the enemy needs to look out because we're going to vanquish him. But I do like the struggle represented in the writing of those who can properly give it its due, its expression, and its humanity. And for certain, that I believe that Mourid Barghouti was able to do that, and to do it in a way that helps you to think about yourself as a human being, and kind of reflect on the kind of struggles that are facing Palestinians, and what they mirror to us all about our lives and the kind of world that we live in. So just firstly, to say a few words about Mourid Barghouti. He was born in 1944 near Ramallah in Palestine, in the village of Deir Ghassana. He was the second of four boys, and when he was born was 4 years before the Nakba. And as a small boy, he became aware of his village suddenly becoming crowded with lots of refugees, and aware therefore of the Nakba in that sense, in that, it was reflected around him, but his family actually didn't experience any hardship in that time. He left Palestine in 1963-64, and he went to Egypt, and he studied English in Cairo University until 1967. He married an Egyptian writer there, and they set up home together. So he was there for 10 years, and they had a baby together. And then he was involved in kind of supporting Palestinian activities. He was involved in the PLO, but he never joined Fatah. In fact, he had a lot of criticism for Yasser Arafat, and said that he really wasn't a Democrat. So anyway, he married Radwar Anshur. She was an Egyptian writer. And in 1967, he graduated just as the 1967 war had broken out, and therefore he wasn't able to return home. Then as I said, he was there in up to 1977. He was involved in a radio station called Radio Palestine, where he read the news and did various other things. This radio station went through different phases. It was closed down by Anwar Sadat. When he came to power, reopened and then reclosed. In 1977, he criticized Sadat when Sadat visited Jerusalem. He criticized him for his connections and his basically prostrating himself before the Israelis. Sadat responded really angrily and demanded that he be kicked out of the country. And one morning, he opened his apartment door to Egyptian police, who handcuffed him and took him to the airport, and he was expelled from Egypt. And he went to live in Hungary, in Budapest, where he spent 13 years, and then was only finally allowed back to Egypt in 1995 when he was taken off the blacklist. So obviously that was a tremendously long time, not only to be exiled from your own country, but exiled from your country where you were living with your wife and your young son. So in 1995, he then also was able to return to Palestine because of changes made under the Oslo Agreement. And in that time, after that time, once he did return, he lived in Palestine on and off. He lived between Palestine, Jordan, and Egypt, more or less, for the rest of his life. He, in fact, took a position up in the Palestinian Authority. He was offered a position to prepare a history of their archaeological and artistic and other cultural places of significance. But then he found that the money that had been assigned to it had all disappeared into somebody's pockets, and he complained about it, and the bosses defended the people who had stolen the money, the other bureaucrats who'd stolen the money, and then they tried to buy him off. He arrived into work one day and into his office, and there were like new leather chairs, which drove him completely crazy and made him even more determined to resign and to have nothing to do with it. Now, it's interesting, like he says of that experience in an interview and also in his book, that the Palestinians are not a beautiful landscape. They are people who make mistakes, including corruption. He did, however, have intense anger at the Palestinian Authority from then on, and would have nothing much to do with it. It put him in a strange position because many of his contemporaries who went back after Oslo were actually on the Palestinian Authority. And even you yourselves may know people who've done that. I myself have met people who were really principled fighters and, would never have given in to the kind of corruption that they subsequently did when they went back and they joined the Palestinian Authority. So, okay. So within his writing, his poetry and his prose, and I'm not familiar really with his poetry, I'm much more familiar with his prose, having read his two memoirs. The themes of displacement and the themes of occupation are very much to the fore. His son, Tamimi, is also a very well-known poet now in his own right. And again, I wouldn't be very familiar with him. A lot of his stuff hasn't been translated into English. And he's very uncompromising in that he always writes in the kind of the local language, and I believe that it is extremely hard to translate because of that in order to retain the meaning of what he's saying. He's also a performance poet. If you see him, I've seen videos of him speaking, reciting his poetry, and he does seem like really energized individual who's expressing his anger and passion very well in Arabic, of the Arabic of Palestine. So what I want to do is I just want to say a few words about each of his memoirs, and hopefully I can convey to you what I think is so beautiful about his writing. Um, his book, I Saw Ramallah, was written after his first visit back to Palestine in 1995. This was after 30 years of exile, and he found himself on the bridge called the Kamara Crossing, which is the only border between Jordan and the West Bank. It's got various names. The Jordanians call it King Hussein Bridge, but the Palestinians just call it the bridge. He describes being there and like looking at his surroundings and feeling that there was nothing ostentatious at all, or nothing grand, or particularly historic about being where he was, and those surroundings. It's quite a small bridge over a river that had a very sluggish flow that day. I believe the River Jordan is not an immense river at all, but particularly not at that point of crossing. The bridge is controlled on one side by the Jordanians and on the other side by the Israelis. And so he crossed over, and he met, the first person he met was an Israeli soldier. And he looks at this man, and he starts to kind of wonder about him. And one of the interesting things about Mourid Barghouti is how he surveys the Israelis. He doesn't have, that anger in him that you would expect. He kind of is like quite dispassionate about them. He thinks like they seem to be some sort of a strange species to him. He's wondering, how can that person incorporate the project within his own being? What is he like when he's at home? So this soldier was standing there with a big gun and, obviously fully ready to take him out if he needed to. But he wondered about him, what his background was, who he was at home, how did he incorporate his inhumanity, the inhuman project that he's part of, with his human self. Then he looked, there was a poster of Masada, which is a mythological struggle of the Israelis where they refused to surrender in a particular battle. And he describes this as perhaps this poster being there on the crossing as a signal to Palestinians that the Israelis are never going to give up. Then he moves from there into the clearinghouse for people coming over the border. And the first people, again, to greet him there are the Israelis. And he has to go through the machine and be checked and, whatever. And then after that, he has to fill in these forms. So he goes to hand the form back to the Israeli soldier or police officer. Police officer says, okay, fine. Now you hand that to the Palestinian police officer. So he hands it to the Palestinian police officer. Then he said, Palestinian police officer, what do I do? He said, hand it back to the Israeli police officer. So here you have a situation where the Palestinian security forces are just completely under the control of the Israelis in terms of who's going to be allowed into the West Bank. And he says of the man, the Palestinian policeman, it was clear that the agreements, meaning the Oslo agreements, placed him in a position where he could make no decisions. So he's completely powerless. Then he went closer. Sorry, then he got in a taxi and he went to Jericho and then into a taxi to Ramallah. And on his journey back, he looks at the land around him and he said, oh, it's not like how I imagined it would be. It looked very dry and there didn't seem to be the olive trees and the fruit trees that he'd remembered. And he thought about how, when you would hear Palestinians in exile speak about the land, how they spoke about how rich the land was, how green the land was. And he wondered whether, this was a mythology or whether actually things had happened, whether the land had been destroyed in the 30 years since he left. Um, at the beginning, when he goes over the checkpoint, there's lots of Israeli flags. And then as they move away towards Ramallah, the Israeli flags start to thin out and you see Palestinian flags, and he settles back and he starts to feel more comfortable. But then the Israeli flags start to emerge again. And he talks about how when the road gets good, the Israeli flags start to emerge, and then you start to see the settlements. And he talks about like how a feeling of depression came over him, you know, something that he didn't want to admit to, a feeling of secure, that there wasn't really any security there, that this really wasn't Palestine that he was returning to. And he talked about how he saw these settlements up on their stepped hills and with their white stone and tiled roofs. And you know, if you look, well, if you've been there, you've seen them. But if you look at any program on the West Bank settlements, you'll see how they are generally up a hill, sloping down. And they do look to me like quite strange, you know, something otherworldly about them. Anyway, he says, how did we let them build all these cities, these fortresses, these barracks year after year? And he refers to how a friend of his told him about how near his own village, the lights of the settlements proliferating year after year until finally they encircled the whole village. They had gradually and in the shade of our own long silence spread everywhere. And he wonders, like, how did they let this happen? How did the Palestinian Authority agree to something that could facilitate these settlements in the Oslo Agreement? And basically, like, I suppose he's so angry. And then he says, I'm just going to read this quote because I think this is very interesting for us. He says, if you hear a speaker on some platform use the phrase, dismantle the settlements, then laugh to your heart's content. These are not children's fortresses of Lego or Meccano. These are Israel itself, Israel the idea and the ideology and the geography and the trick and the excuse. That these weren't an aberration. These aren't something that could simply be stopped on an individual basis. These were the program. The settlements, he said, are also the Palestinian diaspora itself. So the displacement of the Palestinians and the replacements with the settlements. So that's like an image of how the Israeli program is spreading out and moving the Palestinians out. And I also think the image of the village being surrounded by these settlements is a very like strange and vivid one. Okay, so then I just want to move on to say a few words about the second memoir. So the first memoir was about him going back and about everything through his eyes. And it's interesting because he does talk about himself as somebody who he's not particularly gregarious. Maybe his years in exile have made him like, you know, less able, but you know, he wants to talk to his people, but he doesn't actually seem to speak a lot. What he does do very effectively when you read him and you can see it is like absorb his surroundings, absorb the characters and the situation into him like as a sponge and be able to write people afterwards. That's how he describes how he does when he's angry with the Palestinian Authority, he will write them afterwards. When he meets people along the road who interest him or, you know, or he sees as his comrade in arms, he will write them. He will try to be the scribe that puts down in words the experience of the Palestinians. So in the second memoir, I was born there, I was born here. This is about a trip that he made with his son to Ramallah in 2008. And before this trip, he talks about going on his way to go and meet his son in Cairo. He's going to Jordan, and how he talks about an incident that happened on his way to the bridge to go to Jordan. So he gets into this taxi that's been driven by this man, Mahmoud. And the taxi driver has got, I don't know, 6 or 7 other passengers, which is common. That's how they would get around. And he has decided that he's going to avoid the Quilandia checkpoint, which is the official checkpoint on the way between Ramallah and Jericho. So they don't want to go there for understandable reasons. Like, so many people are turned back at checkpoints, and some people don't have all their papers, etc., etc. Anyway, so basically this taxi driver has worked out that he's going to go this route, all the back roads of the West Bank. And as he starts off, he gets a phone call that says that basically the Israeli government has warned foreign diplomats that they're not to go anywhere near the bridge after the next 12 hours because there's going to be an Israeli attack. So they get to know of this because of the fact that the foreign diplomats are told. The Palestinians themselves only find out through their own sources. So anyway, so they get on these back roads, and they get stuck in mud. He describes all the people in the car, the fat man, this man, the lady with the veil that's fully covered. And then they pull it out of the mud and they put it back on the road. And then they come across this trench on the road. And this is very common. What happens is that the Israeli army basically blow up parts of the road in order to prevent the Palestinians taking the back road. So they get stuck here, and there's this big ravine and they can't get across. So Mahmoud, the driver, he just gets out and he makes a phone call, and next minute they see this crane appear alongside these trees, and these 2 lads come out of behind the crane, and they bring it over, and basically they get the car, and all of them in the car, the 8 of them in the car, are picked up by this crane and deposited up in the air and over to the other side of the ravine. And he speaks about the absurdity of it as they all sat there in the car staring downward at the abyss, and the abyss staring back at them. And eventually they did get across safely, and they all got out of the car and they were celebrating, and they looked at each other in relief and joy, he says, as though it was a dream fulfilled, as though we had scored a victory over someone. So, they were really happy at this. Obviously, they had survived it, which was a joy to them, but also it was an adventure that they had embarked on, and just gave them great happiness. And he says, people under occupation may be among those most given to festivity, most ready to celebrate. Very unlike the image of the stereotypical image of everybody being unhappy, everybody being angry and oppressed in their minds all the time. Actually, people look for joy in very small things, very small victories. I think actually, like, just to say, in my experience here in Cork, on St. Patrick's Day, there had been a plan for there to be a Palestinian entry on the St. Patrick's Day parade. And around that time, there were so many people being killed in Gaza. I thought, no, there's no way, we shouldn't be putting those people through that. But in fact, when they had it, it was absolutely fantastic. It was a really joyous occasion. It was a Palestinian wedding, and they had petals and children dancing and kites, and it won the Spirit of the Parade award and ended up, basically going viral on social media. And so what I had thought was something that would be kind of intolerable for people to go out and be happy when their relatives are being murdered was actually something which they really enjoy doing. And In any event, he speaks afterwards about the fact that this journey that he had made that day was actually part and parcel of everyday life for people in Palestine. And obviously that was in 2008, and you would think that, you know, that's something now that's even more the case today. So he then says that the next morning, having got to Jordan safely, he woke up. Next morning, the dead and the wounded lay scattered in their hundreds. So that was such a contrast to their experience that day, their kind of adventure across the back roads of the West Bank. Then he collects his son and he takes him there, and that book, that memoir, is mostly about how his son Tamim sees Palestine, how he kind of absorbs it, how he becomes part of it, and how he sees it through his eyes, with Mourid more or less taking a back seat and watching what happens. So, you know, Mourid is a lot more angry in some ways. He's been left without his father for many years. In Egypt, he can't get citizenship because his father is Palestinian and only his mother is Egyptian, so he's not entitled to Egyptian citizenship. So he would be a stateless person, essentially. And this is obviously a consequence of the war in Gaza. The experiences of Palestinians in the neighboring Arab countries is, you know, not at all a good one. And they are usually seen as the other, even though in many cases, such as in Jordan, they can be in the majority. Okay, well, look, I know I've spoken for quite some time now, and I just want to finish by basically saying a few words of one of his poems. I'm not a great poetry reciter, so you'll forgive me. I'm good at reading things, but I'm not a performer or an artist. Actually, it's not actually a poem at all. It's a piece of his writing, of his prose. So he's here remembering, because lots of the time in his writing, in his memoirs, he's remembering people and he's remembering situations and he's telling you about them, like as he's, you know, going through his experience, going through his journey, he's remembering them back. So he's remembering about how he was kicked out of Egypt and how he said that this would be the last slap in the face that he would take for that, from that regime. He says, "I am not a piece of music, and I am not a play contemplating men's destinies on a darkened stage. I am a father, a husband, a man with a cause, a poet, a son, and an uncle. I'm an adult, and I'm supposed to provide answers and not just questions. I got used to my expulsion from Egypt and have made old news. I walk the roads of the world, turning that page and trying with all my might to forget it. Life, though, taught me that you have to be free in order to choose, or be confused, or decide, or demolish, or build, or forgive, or apologize, or accept, or refuse likewise. And here's the rub. You have to be free in order to forget. The world didn't let me be free, so I could forget." So that's it from me.
Thank you very much. And I mean, that was worth waiting for, wasn't it? Thank you. Thank you, Comrade. If you have any comments or questions, please click raise hand and I can bring you in. I mean, I quite liked, I read up a bit about him today, and he describes himself, so he makes a big point about this is not resistance poetry, this is not exile poetry, but clearly, I mean, what he writes is as an exiled person, isn't it? I mean, he does write from that perspective. It would be very difficult, I think, from somebody with that background and that life and biography to write not about resistance, etc. Do you think? But why do you think he described it as not wanting to be seen as resistance poetry?
Well, I think he wants to be able to talk about mundane things and to talk about, the ordinary things in people's lives and the ordinary beauty of the world. He doesn't want to have to write in grand words about the heroism of the resistance. He doesn't want to sentimentalize it. Like, I like the fact that he's not showing the Palestinian people as absolute heroes, he's critical of them. He's critical of the fact, particularly, of course, critical of the fact that the Palestinian Authority have given away so much. And then in other ways, he's critical of them for letting I think he's very critical generally of them letting the Israelis take so much. He also, and I didn't mention this, he's very critical of the rise of Islam. He speaks, maybe it was in that piece you read, Tina, about living in Egypt under Nasser, and said that it was a fantastic place to be. The culture was just everywhere. You got to go to theatre and musical events and whatever really cheaply, and it was secular. He really, you could see that even now he describes the veiled woman in the piece that I referred to, that he's not keen on any of that. He was a secular individual. I should have said that he died in 2021.
So he was a follower of Nasser, or like many sort of secular Arabs.
Yes.
Were. Yeah. I also see that he wrote quite interestingly about the Oslo Agreement, where he's, a lot of people on the left still hold up the Oslo Agreement as some brilliant way forward, if only, there hadn't been the assassination, etc. But he wrote in his view, the Oslo Agreements were not the work of leaders, but of people led and dictated to by the Israeli authorities and Western powers. Every serious problem, sovereignty, refugees, the status of Jerusalem, they were all postponed. They divided a cake which is imaginary, which is a very nice way of putting it. Did he put forward anything in his poetry about his vision of how Palestine could be free?
No, well, I think that he didn't have a political program. He just simply wanted Palestine to be free. I think he didn't want there to be any compromises. Like, he was critical, as well as the Palestinian Authority, he was also critical of Hamas, said that they were quite infantile in how they dealt with the Israelis, that the Israelis were far too clever for them. So I think that he believed that you had to stand firm against the Israelis and stop them taking the land. And he obviously, when he went back to work for the Palestinian Authority, he obviously believed in Palestinian nationhood and hoped that they would get something out of the deal. I think it wasn't until afterwards that he realized how bad a deal it was after that journey, in 1995. So I would say he was a secular Palestinian nationalist. Yeah, that's what I would say. I mean, not a nationalist in the sense of an Arab nationalist, rather than it's certainly not a Muslim, an active practicing Muslim.
No, you certainly presented him very well, and I shall have a look at his books. I've not read him, I have to admit. Who reads him? I mean, is he very famous amongst the Palestinians? Do they? I mean, this is a sort of interesting question, isn't it? Do Palestinians, when you're struggling to survive, when when you don't know where tomorrow's food's coming from, do you have time? Do you have the headspace to look at poetry, to read, and to look into culture?
Well, he's very well known among Palestinians. When I've asked Palestinians I know here about him, they kind of, they refer to him as one of the greats. And oh, absolutely, people are completely into poetry and song. It's just part of their lives, I think. Like, that's been my experience. And I think that, like, that question that you referred to there is how people express their opposition, their struggle, um, through culture is a fundamental one for people who are in struggle. And I suppose, I mean, I wouldn't want to say that Ireland is unique, because obviously it's not unique. People all over the world who have struggles. People produce, their cultural, their songs and their poetry and their music and their drama all over the world. But in struggle, I suppose Ireland is quite unique, and then so is Palestine. So they do meet, and sometimes it can be, like I see Jerry there, it can be really mythologized, and sometimes it can be a bit boring. I used to think when I was growing up some of it, but it's amazing, like speaking in Ireland, how it's become very popular again. How many of the old stuff is coming back again. But I think that for people who are in struggle, songs and poetry are very important.
Yeah,
Exactly. Terry was talking about South Africans, exactly. Music. Yeah.
I think I've seen an interview with Mourid Barghouti that he also said he often read in refugee camps and stuff, and there were always packed tents of people wanting to listen to him, speak to him afterwards, etc., and share experience. So thank you very much, and that was really very interesting. Anything else you want to say about him?
No, I think, well, hopefully I've been able to give you something of an idea of how he writes, but I would recommend him. They're short books. He doesn't write in long flowing sentences, and the translations of him are apparently very, very good. I can only say that to me, they read really beautifully.
Great. Unless there's any questions from the audience, please click raise hand. Otherwise, we'll let you go. I know you need to go to another meeting.
That's
I think
okay.
it's Palestine meeting. So thank you very much,
Palestine organizing meeting.
Okay.